Wonderful. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Humanities Project Student Talks, session number 24. My name is Victoria, and I am the Student Projects Coordinator here at Polygence, and it's a pleasure to moderate and judge today's sessions. So for presenters, just for those who joined a little bit late, please request to share your audio and visual in this session, and I will then usher you up to the screen to share your presentation. Please be sure to have your presentation up and ready to go in a separate tab so that we can begin seamlessly. I will then add myself back to the session with no video and no audio to give you a 2-minute warning of when it's time to start wrapping up. We will also then have a Q&A in between each presentation. So for all of you who are watching, please feel free to type into the Q&A on the right-hand side of your screen to ask questions for the presenters. We have 4 wonderful presenters today, and I'm so excited to hear about the variety of topics that they have been researching throughout their Polygence program. And so first, I would like to welcome up Tanmay Lakhotia, a senior from Fremont, California.
Hello. Hi, my name is Tanmay, and this is my project, Mitigating Homelessness in San Francisco, a study of causes, existing policies, and new proposals. This project delivered a 40-page research paper divided in 3 sections, consisting of the questions, who are the homeless, what policies are currently helping them, and why do these policies need mending, and how this goal will be reached. Some initial notes before I begin my presentation. In this presentation, I decided to focus on some causes of homelessness in San Francisco, not all. For example, in the right-hand side, you will see a graph depicting that the #1 cause of homelessness across 3 separate years was a lost job. However, I'm not focusing on employment or eviction in this presentation. Rather, I'm focusing on healthcare, prison reform, as well as mental health and physical issues. I'm also focusing on understanding the external factors contributing to certain trends. For example,
I'm sorry, Tanmay, I hate to interrupt, but would you mind clicking present on your presentation so we can all see your slides a little bit bigger? Thank you.
I would like to understand the external factors contributing to certain trends. For example, there's no single factor that contributed to a rise in drug use, which is why it's important to analyze multiple trends that could have contributed to a certain rise. Finally, I want to focus on eliminating casual claims. Every sentence in this research paper is backed by credible data sourced from various sources such as governmental and private organizations. 492 citizens out of 100,000 are homeless in the city of San Francisco, the highest rates of street homelessness in the entire United States. 95% of these homeless people are unsheltered or unsteadily sheltered, and they don't know where they're going to be sleeping the next night. 45% of these people are parenting youth, 27% abuse drugs, and 25% suffer from severe mental illness. Clearly, homelessness is a giant problem in San Francisco. So how is this problem being addressed? Well, #1, starting with Proposition 47. What is Proposition 47? This was a proposition passed by the California legislature in 2015. And basically, as relating to homelessness, it reduced personal drug use from a felony to a misdemeanor. A felony stays on your permanent record much longer and impacts your chances of things like getting a job or getting a home much more than a misdemeanor. And it also did the same for any theft under the value of $950. For example, if a person were to steal any item worth less than $950, they would only be tried as a misdemeanor, not as a felony. Proposition 47 was meant to help ease prison overcrowding and save money. California has a big problem with sending too many people to prison, and this policy was meant to help reduce those numbers. And finally, savings would be invested into neighborhood development programs. On the right-hand side, you can see a graph that shows the steady rise of savings from Proposition 47. And as to how this impacts homelessness, is that one of the biggest problems impacting the homeless are drug use, and Proposition 47 increased drug use exponentially. While it had good intentions, Proposition 47 also had some severe flaws. First of all, business owners, especially small business owners, were hit hard by this policy. Because theft was no longer being prosecuted as a felony, many business owners were hit with small amounts of theft, and the police were not able to help them, resulting in them losing much of their money. Smaller business owners were not able to take in these losses as big as large nationwide chains. Secondly, property theft has spiked, increasing to over 100% since the year of 2012, as you can see on the graph in the right-hand side. Personal drug use and overdoses have also hit the homeless community hard. Drug overdoses have risen steadily since 1999, and in recent years they have spiked on the top right graph. Finally, citizens are frustrated with lack of effective arrests by law enforcement. They see criminals wandering the streets and people who have clearly been stealing and committing crimes, yet they're not being arrested because of Proposition 47. And since 2014, drug-induced deaths have jumped over 500% in San Francisco, which is one of the biggest crises impacting the homeless population. Some proposed solutions to reduce this problem were to reduce a $950 theft limit to $100. This means that any theft under the value of $100 would only be prosecuted as a misdemeanor, and everything above that as a felony, as it was being prosecuted before. This is to ensure that business owners are kept in business. Secondly, we could jail repeat offenders for property and drug crimes. Because Proposition 47 has loosened drug restrictions so much, jailing repeat offenders and those who are just abusing the system, and not those who make honest mistakes, will help mitigate this crisis much more. Then we can control drugs that flow through the street through task forces such as drug task forces, which target drug dealers and drug impacted areas of the city. Drop boxes, which can take in drugs and needles that the homeless would have used, as you can see on the bottom right, and increased court-mandated rehab for the homeless population. Third, directing more savings to drug reformation. Proposition 47 brings in $122.5 million, out of which 62.5% is dedicated towards drug enforcement. Dedicating more resources towards police action and drug reformation instead of community development and rehab will help mitigate this crisis in a much greater manner. Finally, prosecuting harmful theft as a felony. There have been a series of instances in which theft has taken a very harmful turn, which has led an injury towards the business owners and those being stolen from. And prosecuting harmful theft as a felony will help reduce the amount of injury that these people face. It costs $81,000 to incarcerate a prisoner for 1 year. And although this number is a very large number, incarcerating just a little bit more people than the ones that have been freed will help mitigate this crisis greatly. The second policy we'll be looking at is healthcare. San Francisco healthcare. Today, I'm going to be focusing on one specific department of the healthcare, which is known as the San Francisco Healthcare for the Homeless program. This is a mobile van service that offers street outreach services to people who can't afford healthcare as well as the homeless. On the top right, you can see an image of one of the mobile vans, and this is funded by a federal grant and private donations, all totaling $26 million. This organization has partnered with Orion White, which is a national organization that focuses on mitigating STDs to deliver AIDS and STD care. San Francisco has an unusually high number of STDs, as you can see on the bottom right graph. So taking care of this problem is also one that will help tackle the homeless population and mitigate this crisis, since they do suffer from a problem of sharing needles. Over 90% of the San Francisco Healthcare for the Homeless program patients live under poverty levels. And finally, only trained medical staff are allowed to volunteer with this organization. Some flaws of healthcare are that it has a low social media presence, and reduced data transparency has led to a less lack of knowledge as to how they are helping out. Some proposed solutions to fix this problem are conducting market research and directing funding towards optimizing their social media accounts. Their social media accounts are old and not very effective. So directing more funding towards this issue will help them reach their target audiences better. And finally, by being more transparent with their data and releasing reports, they can help ensure the trust of the city and their people. And 95% of their clients are uninsured or on federal insurance, so they are making an impact. Thank you for my presentation, and I'll be fielding any questions now.
Thank you so much for that wonderful and informative presentation. We do have a few questions for you. So the first being, what was the most surprising thing that you discovered during your research?
The most surprising thing I discovered about my research was just how much money San Francisco spends on mitigating homelessness, and spends over $1 billion on multiple projects ranging from healthcare, drug use, and employment. Yet we see so little of the homelessness crisis actually being mitigated. And the reason that I found this to be true was because much of this money is invested in hiding and concealing this homeless crisis from the public, rather than finding proper solutions backed by data to help drive this crisis to the ground.
Fascinating. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. And so at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that any theft over $950 is considered a felony, but under is considered a misdemeanor. Where did that $950 number come from?
So this is a number that is officially cited in the Proposition 47, which was passed by the California legislature. So this is a number that they chose because they found that a lot of auto theft and a lot of theft from vehicles was under this or approaching this limit. And because many of the people who were stealing under or approaching this limit were being sent to prison, they believe that choosing the number of $950 is the threshold by which they can reduce the number of people they're sending to prison, but still prosecute as a misdemeanor.
Got it. Got it. Well, thank you. And so the other question that was asked were drug users more inclined to continue using drugs because it was downgraded to a misdemeanor, or was the problem simply consistent and they were just never put into prison?
Great question. So as I mentioned before, there can't be a single factor that is responsible for a rise in drug use. But what I can say for sure is that by reducing this to a misdemeanor, it does mean that they could be incentivized to use more drugs. So while it can't be said for certain that that reducing it to a misdemeanor helped crime rise or helped drug use rise, it can be said for certain that helping making drug use a felony again instead of a misdemeanor would certainly help drive drug use down. And the trend that we were seeing with the drug use rising could be a combination of several factors. For example, it could be eviction, it could be mental health crises, it could just be a general rise in drug use because of a lack of police effort to help combat the drug on the streets.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that insight. And a final question here. How has your research for this project impacted what you hope to study in the future, if at all?
So I was not sure if I wanted to go into research because I intend to major in economics, but after researching these crises and looking at all this data-backed evidence and building this report and project, it has really impacted the way I think about academic research and professional research as a whole. And I think I'm much more inclined to continue professional research and academic research such as shown in this paper. And I hope to maybe conduct research into political science topics or some other social science topics, especially other California reform laws such as job laws or Proposition C. So that's how it's impacted it, yes.
Amazing, amazing. Well, thank you again for your wonderful presentation. I am now going to usher you off the stage and invite our second presenter, Sabrina Lopez, to the stage. Sabrina is a college student from Las Vegas, Nevada.
Hi. Alrighty. Hello and good afternoon. My name is Sabrina Lopez, and I will be presenting an overview of my paper, The Grounds for Regulating Big Tech, an Evaluation of Harm and Responsibility. The digital landscape has evolved. As societal dependence on technology for everyday tasks and services grows, so too does the extent to which we allow technology corporations into our personal lives. Tech companies now require more user data and offer less transparency than ever. Is this for better or for worse? As we all well know, This new dynamic between users and companies creates potential for ethical tensions. For example, from the obscurity of corporate data practices has arisen a data economy, wherein various technology firms, proprietors of apps and websites engage in the trading of accumulated user data, such as user preferences, habits, and demographics with outside vendors. The 5 largest firms involved in the data economy are Apple, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and Amazon. They together share a $4 trillion combined market value. The data economy may not be explicitly immoral, but it leaves open great temptation for technology corporations to distribute data to unquestionable or even unsavory vendors. For instance, in 2018, Facebook and political data analysis firm Cambridge Analytica covertly seized huge amounts of user data through misleading third-party apps in order to build psychographic profiles on global electorates. Political campaigns, which rely heavily on demographic ad targeting, utilize these profiling tactics to influence advertising to supporters and opposition alike. Since we know tech corporations are in fact capable of committing harm towards users, this brings us to the central question of my paper. Who can be held morally responsible for the actions of technology corporations? The ambiguous moral status of the corporation extends beyond just technology firms, and in all cases can leave clear who or what should bear responsibility for actions, including harms done by corporations. But in order to answer this question, I must first clarify what I mean by moral responsibility. When one is morally responsible, they are to blame for both the occurrence of an action as well as its moral implications. When one merely causes an action, they are responsible for its occurrence, but not necessarily the moral implications of that action. For example, when you discipline a dog for chewing on the remote, you're not disciplining her for a moral failing. You're correcting her action of causing the event. You've isolated the blame for the cause of an undesired action from the moral responsibility for that action, which the dog in fact committed. You can do this because you know intuitively that the dog lacks the ability to tell right from wrong. So we're able to acknowledge that a harm has been committed without needing a morally responsible party. So now, in order to figure out if technology corporations can be held morally responsible for their actions, we have to first determine whether or not they're a moral agent. A moral agent is a being capable of discerning and acting in accordance with what is known to be right or wrong. As I mentioned in other words earlier, the distinction between a moral agent and a non-moral agent is the ability to be held morally responsible for harmful actions. Because moral agents are aware of harm, they have obligations to not only avoid harm by acting morally, but to hold those who cause harm accountable for the sake of avoiding any future harm. Why is this the case? Well, partially because of our first criteria, which we'll use to determine the moral agency of corporations. Moral judgment is this criteria. It is the capacity to reflect on the moral implications of one's actions and observe these considerations when acting. Moral judgment is what gives moral agents the ability to discern right from wrong. It is the most basic criteria for moral agency. Moral judgment involves reasoning, reflection, and the ability to adapt one's behavior in response to conclusions one draws about what they determine to be a good or a bad action. As I mentioned on the last slide, moral agents have obligations to avoid present and future harms by holding fellow moral agents accountable. They have these obligations because they can each morally judge. It is also for this reason that only moral agents can be held morally responsible for their actions. In reference to the corporation, it cannot experience unified moral judgment because they cannot engage in collective reasoning. What we mean when we say they is the moral agents behind the corporation, the actors whose wills most directly influence the trajectory of that corporation's taken actions. The corporation's controlling members are the ones who ultimately dictate what the corporate entity does. However, these controlling members are not able to collectively engage in reasoning about present and future actions in a way which draws unified moral conclusions. Controlling members can undergo individual reasoning and judgment within themselves, but it is not possible for the collective to be consistent in accurately conveying the scope of this internal reasoning in which they can individually engage. For this reason, it's also idealistic to overestimate the truthfulness of what they'll reveal to one another in this collective reasoning action. This undermines the ubiquitousness of the collective moral conclusion and makes them incomparable to true moral judgment by a moral agent. This means that the corporation does not meet this essential criteria for moral agency. Another criteria in which the corporation falls short of moral agency is through its ability to be intentional. It is stipulated that we can connect the intentional decision-making of a corporation back to its ability to act as a moral collective. I reject this because truly unanimous intentionality between the controlling members of a corporation is not consistent. The presence of unspoken motives and morally incompatible ends ensures that corporations, as a singular entity, are not consistently capable of unified intentionality. If we know that unified intentionality within the corporation is inconsistent and considered corporations moral agents only when we knew that true intentionality was shared between all members, then it would require fellow moral agents interacting with the corporation to allow it adaptive moral agency status, which is practically implausible. So realistically, corporations as an entity meet neither the moral judgment nor the intentionality criteria for moral agency and therefore are not moral agents. So Because corporations are not true moral agents, then they cannot be held directly morally responsible for their actions, harmful or otherwise. This is obviously not an intuitive conclusion, as it goes against our impulse to seek responsibility from them for events such as Cambridge Analytica. We know that harms have been done, so surely we feel that there must be a responsible party. Well, corporate entities, though they cannot be held directly responsible for harms themselves, can still carry out harm in virtue of a moral agent, or agents such as controlling members. In this way, corporations are a unique entity, a vicarious agent, or an agent which functions as an extension of a full moral agent, and can carry out morally loaded actions, though it is not a moral agent itself. To better illustrate this concept, let's consider a thought experiment. Consider alien planet P, populated by moral agents, collectively launches an unmanned ship towards Earth with the intention of Earth's annihilation. Once launched, the trajectory of the ship cannot be interfered with. It will collide with Earth as it was intended to. In this case, we notice two important things. Firstly, we notice that the ship, though loaded with immoral intentions, does not satisfy our criteria for moral agency. And secondly, that the Earth is populated in part by humans who are moral agents. This means that humans possess the moral obligation to avoid harm where they interpret it. In this case, the ship, though not a moral agent, poses a direct harm to humans. So the humans of Earth possess an obligation to avoid harm from the ship by defending themselves from its attack. In this case, there also happens to be moral agents behind the ship's actions, the inhabitants of planet P who initially launched the ship, to whom we can trace the responsibility for their vicarious agents' actions. So the humans of Earth have a duty to hold morally responsible those who launched the ship, the members of planet P who are moral agents, and the members of planet P have an obligation to accept that moral responsibility of which their moral failing orchestrated. Therefore, the moral obligations of all agents in this situation remain, even in the presence of a vicarious agent. So, in conclusion, technology corporations cannot be held responsible for the harms they commit because they are not moral agents, but rather vicarious agents who lack the ability to bear full moral responsibility. Though, because they are vicarious agents, this means that they're controlled by moral agents who do possess this ability. The moral agents, the controlling members of a corporation whose decisions directly influence the trajectory of their vicarious corporate entity's actions, are ultimately morally responsible for those actions. If our thought experiment is true, and if moral agents have a moral obligation to protect themselves from harm and hold those who harm accountable, then when users of technologies who are themselves moral agents are met with the potential to be harmed by the practices of technology companies, they have an obligation to defend themselves from instances of harm from any type of agent. In reality, in practice, this could take many forms, according to the degree of harm experienced by users. In cases where harms committed are found to be unlawful, it could look like the regulation of corporate vicarious entities and the prosecution of controlling moral agents. Regardless, the importance for both users and lawmakers to possess an awareness with whom the responsibility for harms committed against them lies is paramount in seeking retribution for those moral failings, and for having a clear picture of where users' reactive attitudes towards these harms can be directed. Finally, it is in users of all technology's best interest that we remain aware of what information we share, who we share it to, and who's responsible for what happens to it. Thank you all for your time, and special thank you to my mentor, Kevin John, for helping me with this project.
Thank you, Sabrina, for that project. I also really loved your URL logos on the presentation. Well, great. So we have a couple of questions for you. So the first being, are these controlling members responsible for other questions the company must take a stance on? For example, the companies who took a stance on Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, that would be, so the company itself in taking that stance would be a vicarious entity taking a stance. While their action in taking that stance is positively morally charged, you could say, it's ultimately constructed by the vicarious members. So while there is just like in my ship analogy, while there is a positive connotation to that action of taking a stance, there's no true moral responsibility that we can afford the corporation for doing a good action, for instance.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
and the other question is, what was the most challenging part about your research?
Well, Kevin and I started with just a big bunch of questions, and I came to Kevin and I was like, let's sort through this together. And so he and we really poured through the literature surrounding corporate moral responsibility, and I went back and forth on my stance a lot. And it was really in the last hour that I came to a full picture of what it was that I believed. And so really seeing all sides of this issue and exploring the literature, and it's really greatly accounted for. There's a lot of documentation towards towards corporate moral responsibility. So that was probably the most difficult part.
Amazing. And I'm going to recycle a question from the first presenter here as well. So how has this research project impacted what you hope to study in the future, if at all?
My initial, I moved around on what I wanted to do. I knew that I wanted to do philosophy, but I feel that what we choose to study in philosophy should be something that can be tangibly represented in real life. Now, that we're not just arguing definitions, because there are philosophies needed in our daily life. And so I felt that the digital ethics realm really needed people thinking behind that. So this was kind of my foray into knowing whether or not that was what I wanted to pursue. Now, after finishing this project, I feel that it is. So it really helped solidify that for me.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, we're so glad that you had that experience, and thank you so much for presenting today. I'm going to usher you off of the screen here and invite our next presenter. So next we have Samantha Huebner, a senior from Moraga, California. So Sammy, I'm going to invite you up here.
Hey, wait. Can you guys see my screen? Okay, so my project is on a research paper that I wrote about Pride and Prejudice, and it's called Breaking the Bildungsroman, Pride and Prejudice's Deviation from the Genre. So I'm going to start with a plot summary of Pride and Prejudice. It follows Elizabeth Bennet, who is a 20-year-old girl, and the story follows her interactions with her family, friends, and men, especially the proud and rich Mr. Darcy, in the late 18th and early 19th century in the English countryside. Mr. Darcy comes to town and initially insults Elizabeth and her family, but then falls in love with Elizabeth. He proposes to her, but is rejected because he's been rude to her. And after the rejection, he writes her a letter defending himself, and Elizabeth starts to like him. After that, he saves the Bennet family from ruin when one of Elizabeth's sisters runs off with a man, and this helps contribute to their happy marriage at the end of the story. So my project works on Pride and Prejudice as a Bildungsroman, which is a type of novel that follows a character's development and has three key aspects. So normally in the beginning, the protagonist is alienated for society, and for female protagonists like Elizabeth, this is a result of not meeting societal expectations. Throughout the book, the protagonist experiences significant character development or transformation, and it ends with the protagonist being accepted into society, and this is usually as a result of that character development. So my paper is in response to critics' views on Pride and Prejudice as a Bildungsroman. So two scholars, Amelie Svensson and Lorna Ellis, argue that Pride and Prejudice fits this classic structure that I mentioned of the character's alienation, then development, and then reintegration. And they place heavy emphasis on Elizabeth's character change and say that this reintegration is a result of her conforming to society's expectations. However, in my thesis, I argue that Elizabeth displays many of the characters of a Bildungsroman protagonist, but I argue that Elizabeth's character does not, in fact, undergo the expected mode of development, a situation that is underscored by the novel's otherwise close adherence to the genre. This circumstance then begs the question, if this is a Bildungsroman, why did Austen choose to not change Elizabeth's character? So in two main ways, Pride and Prejudice is a Bildungsroman, and I think this was intentional by Austen. So she starts the novel alienated from society because of her independent spirit. She rejects two proposals, which is very uncommon for a woman at time, and it shows that she has different values, valuing her happiness over future security, and she's also disliked by other women because of her independence. Elizabeth also fits the genre through her reintegration into society when she marries Mr. Darcy, entering higher society, married into a family with greater wealth and greater connections, and we can see that she's truly accepted because she's treated better by some of her former adversaries. So I'm arguing that Austen purposely made it a Bildungsroman, and because of that, there's this expectation for the development aspect. So there's this key moment of an expectation for change after Darcy's failed proposal, when he writes her a letter explaining his interference with Elizabeth's sister and the man that she was courting, and her dealings with Wickham, who is a man they both know. So the expectation is that this realization of her faults, as she falsely accused Mr. Darcy of two things, will change her character, and as critics see, they think it removes her Pride and Prejudice, as well as other changes that I'll get into. So critics think that she shows a new concern for what others might think of her family and herself, and thus displays a newfound self-consciousness. However, this is wrong because Elizabeth has always been embarrassed by her family's bad behavior and has worked to keep them in check. This isn't new, and rather it's a constant part of her character. They also say that she's learned to adjust what is expected of her, as there's this idea that she loses her independence to mold to society's expectations, but we can see that this is false when Mr. Darcy's aunt, Lady Catherine, demands her to not marry Mr. Darcy and threatens to make her a societal outcast. She disregards Lady Catherine's expectations and the overall general expectation that she will listen to a very powerful woman to whom few say no to. Rather, I argue that Elizabeth's character doesn't change. And so the scholar Anderson says the same thing, as he says the novel as a whole is not like Emma, organized by a changing character. Elizabeth is mistaken about certain facts, but her character is sound, which is the sentiment that I agree with. So overall, Svensson and Ellis's arguments that Elizabeth experiences character growth, I believe, are false. Also, in the spirit of not developing, Elizabeth's reintegration isn't typical. So the typical integration says that the protagonist will work within the limits of society and accept society's expectations, but Elizabeth's integration is not a result of change, but rather a result of her following her heart, which is the consistent driving force that actively disregards society's expectations, as we saw with her confrontation with Lady Catherine, and rather this reintegration is a happy result but not an intended one. Her marriage isn't one to increase her social status, but rather because Mr. Darcy truly makes her happy. So, in conclusion, Austen does not need to change Elizabeth's character. Her authentic self allows Elizabeth to achieve her own goals and those of the Bildungsroman. So it's her individuality and focus for happiness that shapes her alignment with the genre, because it's this individuality that alienates her at the start, but also allows her to achieve the aspect of reintegration with her marriage to Mr. Darcy. And we can see this happy ending of Elizabeth and Darcy as Austen's idealistic utopia in which women can be themselves and be happy, and an overall encouragement of individuality and authentic happiness in an era of strict social norms. And yeah, that's it. So thank you.
Thank you, Sammy, for that wonderful presentation. We have a few questions for you. The first being, why for your project did you choose to analyze Pride and Prejudice?
I chose it because it's been my favorite book since I was like 9, and it was something I knew I could write a lot about.
Wonderful. And when it comes to the character of Elizabeth, is that the character that you closely identify with, or do you find that other characters are more identifiable for you?
I think I identify with Elizabeth's stubbornness, but I just think she's a really interesting character and kind of like a role model.
And given you were so familiar with the book coming to your research project, what did you find to be the most challenging aspect of your research?
Well, I was familiar with the book, but not familiar with it in an analytical way of like analyzing, like combing through the lines. And also part of it, it's like, it almost made my favorite book, like schoolwork, but I still love it, so.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. I am going to usher you off the stage now. and I am going to invite our last but certainly not least presenter to today's session. We have Ivanka SooHoo, who is a sophomore from Weston, Massachusetts. Ivanka, you're still on mute. I see your chat, so you should be able to unmute. So the red slash is not moving. Let me see if I can help you here. And Ivanka, you're clicking the red slash on the microphone? Yes. Yes, I would suggest try joining again. Still having the issue. Okay. Let me see if I can help. Perhaps, Ivanka, if you try leaving the session entirely and coming back, that might help as well. Okay, one moment. Let me connect with the team really quickly.
Hi, everyone. So just trying to troubleshoot here. So can you try and click on the microphone icon just to unmute yourself?
Ivanka, if you also click the settings icon in the bottom right corner, you should be able to see where your microphone is coming from. And and it may be a symbol switch to your computer, or I see you have headphones as well.
Another possibility would be to just call in from, for example, my phone, and I could put it on the loudspeaker so everyone could hear it.
Oh, Ivanka, I just saw your message. It says there's an error with connecting to the Hopin servers. That's happened to me before as well. If you sometimes restart your page, it allows you to reconnect. Yeah, try to refresh your page. Not working. Oh no. Okay, so we can do as Janos suggested and allow you to present your screen, but then call through an audio. He just posted his phone number in the chat. Oh,
Is it in a Google Slides format? In which case we might be able to share it ourselves. So if you could share the link to the Google slides, yeah. Excellent. Great. So, great, Ivanka. Could you possibly call my phone? I just dropped the number there. And then we'll work through it together. By the way, this is something that I've seen happen at so many scientific conferences. Some of the best presentations come with the little technical glitches, and it's usually a sign that, you know, we really need to pay attention because we are about to witness something very special. So, hello. Hi there.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Can you guys hear Ivanka? Wonderful. Yes, they can hear you.
Great. So like the other projects, I wrote a concept album called Starlight. Next slide. So my name is Ivanka. I'm 15. I'm a sophomore. I played the piano and the flute. And if you could click the animation. I like K-pop and a video game lover, and you can click the next animation. And for those of you wondering if this is singing, I can't sing to save my life. So, next slide, please. To accompany my album, I have album artwork. And if you could click the, I generally went with a minimalistic vibe because my project was called Starlight, so I went with a space and a sky theme. Next slide, please. So if you could click the that was a sample of my.
Yeah.
I wrote 2 songs for my project, but I'm only going to sample one of them since the time is somewhat limited. Next slide, please. If you could click again.
Ivanka,
So,
Ivanka, I think you could take over the slides here if we are not going to play another YouTube music.
okay. Wait, actually, that's not true. I have a few more clips.
Wonderful. Then let's continue sharing Victoria's screen.
Is the share returning or no?
I can do it. Can you see my screen?
So, yes, I can.
Great.
So pretty much I'm going to explain like my process of what I did to write my song. And so the first step of my process was obviously, as a pianist, I played on the piano. So I was experimenting with like chords and different chord progressions and different rhythms and notes to just basically see what worked and what I wanted to incorporate into my song later. I also have thought about like different key and type signatures, which would help the song give like a specific feel that I would want it to have. Next slide. So if you click the, oh, not that, the, okay. So I had like a few songs that I took quite a bit of inspiration from in terms of like format or like instruments. And like mainly those genres were lo-fi genres or instrumentals. So you click the green YouTube video. Or it would start at a specific time. So that was a song called Alone by an artist called Cheese. And I liked how it was kind of a piano-based melody that was mostly an instrumental. And the next clip, if you could just click on the play button. is a song called Beach Walker by an artist called Life. And it falls under this, I guess, not as well-known genre called lo-fi, which is mostly based on instrumentals as well, as there aren't really lyrics or singing like your generic pop song. So, next slide. So, pretty much the next step of the process was actually writing the music. And I used this piece of software called MuseScore, and it essentially writes sheet music. So the image in the top is basically what sheet music looks like. Most people have probably seen it at some point. So basically, to enter notes and things like that, you would just use your standard QWERTY keyboard, and it types in your notes for you. And if you want to change things up, like the rhythm of the notes or what pitch you want them to be in, you can use the other menus depicted in the other three pictures. So after this, you would, next slide. Can you click the animation once? So just to show you what it would look like, you have the notes, the keys and time signatures, and one more click, the score itself. And next slide. So click the animation. The next part of the process is using a digital audio workstation. And it basically is a music production software. And this is where your sheet music goes to, and it's turned into an audio format. So could you click the animation? So your sheet music is exported to this piece of software as a MIDI file. And they are essentially the blue rectangles. You can edit the notes and things like that with the track editor, which is shown in the slide. The next thing is called Plugins. And you have, you can change the instruments. Let's say I wrote sheet music for a piano, but it didn't sound as well as I wanted it to. And I wanted to change it to something like a guitar, for example. So you would use your plugins, and it would open up the green thing with all the knobs on it. And you can also use the FX just to tweak the sound even more if you would like to. So, next slide. So basically, this is what the window looks like. You have your tracks, your track editor. There's something called a MIDI editor, which essentially can edit the notes later on if you don't want to go back to MuseScore. And you have your plugins and FX. So next slide. And click the animation. So there are quite a few roadblocks while I was trying to write this piece, mostly with the high learning curve of digital audio workstations. Like when I first opened it up, just like 50 different settings opened up, and it was all very confusing. And of course, there's like, since there's so many settings, it's very easy to like change something and have it sound completely different, but you may or not want it to sound like that. And of course, like any other type of writing project, there is writer's block, which I struggled a lot with because there's sometimes I just didn't know what to write. And in the end, I think I made something that I really did like. So, final slide. Special thanks to my mentor, Katrin, for teaching me all about music composition in DAWs, and I'll be taking questions now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ivanka. That was fascinating to see all the work you've done and the wonderful music. So excited that you are sharing this with us today.
Well, I'd love to move to Q&A now. So a couple questions for you, Ivanka. The first is, what software did you use to overlay the piano and the flute? Did you use GarageBand?
My project didn't use piano or flute, but as I said in my presentation, I ended up using Pro Tools.
And was this your first time using Pro Tools and writing a song, or have you written other songs in the past?
No, this was my first time.
Great. And another question asked, what exactly is lo-fi?
Well, like I explained earlier, it's kind of more instrumental-based music. It generally tends to have like a chill vibe, I would say. And I picked it because I can't sing.
So what exactly made you want to produce a lo-fi song? What about the genre made you so excited about it?
I've always kind of liked that genre just because I think it sounds cool. Like, music is quite subjective. So I liked it and I wanted to try something new, so I went for it.
Wonderful. And how did this project affect what you're hoping to study in the future?
To be honest, I don't really know. It was just something I've always wanted to try doing. And since I'm a musician who's been playing for a long time, I thought I might try my hand at writing my own music.
Well, great. Well, it was a beautiful song, and thank you so much for your presentation and for Janos for hopping in with his technical skills. So thank you.
Well, Ivanka, I just wanted to add that I think this presentation and the work you did was truly awesome. And I'm really glad that we got to hear the music, beautiful music. And please keep up your work and compose and do more music, because it's going to just make our lives much better. And it will be wonderful to keep hearing this.
Thank you.
Definitely. Well, I am going to usher you off of the stage, Ivanka. And so thank you again, a huge thank you to all of the presenters for your hard work on your projects, and a huge thank you to all of the audience members who joined our session today for coming here and supporting these students' wonderful projects and presentations. We at Polygence are so incredibly proud of our students and all of your accomplishments, and we're so glad that we got to cheer you on today as you presented your work. We would love to encourage you all to continue to attend the symposium sessions today and cheering on some of your fellow Polygence students as they share their work. Thank you to everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.